It was supposed to be the start of something new. College life meant independence, freedom, and late-night study sessions fueled by instant noodles. For Amber Cooper, a sophomore transfer student at Ravenwood University, the move to Shadowview Apartments was just another step in her fresh start. The building, nestled on the edge of campus, was old but charming, with its ivy-covered brick walls and creaky wooden floors. Affordable rent was a bonus, and Amber didn't mind the eerie, abandoned feel of the place. Amber dragged her suitcase up the narrow staircase to the third floor, pausing to catch her breath. The air was heavier here, and the dim lighting from the overhead bulbs cast long, flickering shadows. She stopped in front of door 3B, her new home for the semester. The landlord, an older woman named Mrs. Klein, had been evasive about the details of her new roommate. "You'll meet them when you settle in," she had said with a forced smile. Amber assumed it was just another college student who, like her, couldn't afford to live on their own. She slid the key into the lock, turned it, and pushed the door open. The apartment was surprisingly neat. A cozy living room greeted her with a worn but inviting sofa, a small TV on a wooden stand, and shelves filled with dusty books. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. To the left was the kitchen, compact but functional, and to the right, a narrow hallway led to the bedrooms. Amber called out, "Hello? Anyone home?" Silence. She walked down the hallway and peeked into the first room. It was empty except for a neatly made bed and a desk with a closed laptop. A silver-framed photo sat on the nightstand, but the face in the picture was blurred, as though time had worn it away. "This must be theirs," she muttered, backing out of the room. The second door was slightly ajar, revealing her own room. The walls were bare and the furniture minimal. A bed, a dresser, and a desk. Her suitcase looked out of place against the stark surroundings. Amber unpacked quickly, eager to make the space her own. As she placed a framed photo of her parents on the nightstand, she heard the faint creak of floorboards outside her room. "Hello," she called again, stepping into the hallway. No one answered. Shrugging, she chalked it up to the old building settling and returned to unpacking. But as night fell, the apartment's charm started to wane. The shadows in the corners of the living room seemed darker, and the air colder. Amber made herself a cup of tea and settled on the sofa, flipping through her phone. She had just started scrolling when she heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Amber!" Her heart froze. She glanced around the empty room, her pulse quickening. "Amber!" The voice came again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the living room. It was coming from the hallway. Clutching her phone, she crept toward the source of the sound. The hallway stretched out before her, its shadows deepening. At the end of the hall, the first bedroom door was open wider than before. Amber's breath caught as she noticed movement inside. A figure stood with their back to her, facing the bed. They were tall, their outlines slightly blurred, as if they weren't entirely solid. Hi," Amber stammered, her voice trembling. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to suck in all the light around them. Their lips moved, but the sound that emerged was a guttural whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." Amber stumbled back, nearly dropping her phone. The figure stepped closer, their presence heavy and suffocating. Who are you?" Amber managed to choke out. "I'm your roommate," they replied, their voice echoing as if spoken from the depths of a cavern. Amber's vision blurred, her mind reeling. Her legs gave out and she collapsed to the floor. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the figure looming over her, their hollow eyes unblinking. Amber's hands trembled as she stared at the note. The words, "Do not enter my room again," seemed to pulse on the page, written in jagged, spidery handwriting. Her mind raced to make sense of what had happened. The figure, the ominous warning, the suffocating presence. It felt too real to be a nightmare. She forced herself to take deep breaths, clutching the edge of her desk for stability. "It's just the stress of moving," she whispered to herself, trying to suppress the rising panic. But even as she tried to rationalize, the shadows in the corners of her room seemed to grow darker, heavier. Amber glanced at her phone. It was 3:13 a.m. Sleep was out of the question. Instead, she decided to do some investigating. Grabbing her laptop, she settled onto her bed and typed Shadowview Apartments History into the search bar. Most of the results were mundane. A few rental listings, an article about its construction in the 1930s, and a blog post praising its vintage charm. But one link caught her eye. Mysterious disappearances at Shadowview, urban legend or truth? Her pulse quickened as she clicked the link. The article detailed a series of strange events over the decades: tenants vanishing without a trace, unexplained noises, and sightings of shadowy figures. The writer claimed the building was cursed, but the evidence was scant, mostly based on hearsay. Still, Amber couldn't ignore the similarities to her own experience. "Cursed or haunted," she muttered, closing her laptop. "Great choice, Amber." The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, making the apartment feel almost normal. Amber decided to focus on unpacking and settling in, convincing herself that a good dose of normalcy would push the eerie events from her mind. She had just finished organizing her books when there was a knock at the door. Amber hesitated, then opened it to find Mrs. Klein standing there, her wrinkled face set in a tight smile. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Klein said. "How's everything? Settling in all right?" Amber hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "It's fine. The place is nice, but I didn't realize I had a roommate." Mrs. Klein's smile faltered, just for a moment. "Oh yes, your roommate. They keep to themselves. Quiet as a mouse, really. You shouldn't have any trouble, right?" Amber said slowly. "Do you know much about them? I mean, I haven't really met them yet." Mrs. Klein's eyes darted to the floor. "It's best not to pry, dear. Some people value their privacy." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Amber more unsettled than before. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the apartment's shadows returned. Amber kept the lights on, but it didn't help much. The weight in the air was back, pressing down on her chest like an invisible force. She decided to break the ice with her mysterious roommate. Grabbing a plate of cookies from the kitchen, she approached the first bedroom door. It was closed, just as she had left it that morning. Amber knocked gently. "Hey, I brought some cookies. Thought we could, talk." No response. She knocked again, a little louder. "I'm Amber, by the way. Your new roommate." The silence was deafening. Just as she turned to leave, the door creaked open an inch. A chill swept down her spine. "Leave it on the floor," a voice rasped from within. It was the same hollow voice she had heard the night before. Amber placed the plate on the floor, her hands trembling. "Okay, if you ever want to talk or hang out, I'm around." The door slammed shut. Amber stumbled back, her breath quickening. She retreated to her room, locking the door behind her. Later that night, Amber lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The apartment was silent, but her mind was anything but. She kept replaying the events of the day, trying to piece together what was happening. Around 2 a.m., she heard it again, the creak of floorboards in the hallway. She sat up, straining to listen. The sound was faint but deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. "Just ignore it," she whispered to herself, pulling the covers tighter. But then the footsteps stopped, right outside her door. Amber held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. A soft knock echoed through the room. "Amber," the voice whispered, low and gravelly. "Why didn't you listen?" Amber froze, terror rooting her to the spot. The doorknob rattled, and the voice grew louder. "Amber, open the door." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a shadow seeped in from under the door, pooling on the floor like liquid darkness. Amber scrambled back, pressing herself against the headboard. The shadow twisted and coiled, taking on a vaguely human shape. Two glowing eyes stared back at her, cold and empty. "You shouldn't have come here," the shadow hissed. Amber screamed as the figure lunged toward her. Amber couldn't bring herself to stay in the apartment that night. After the chilling message and the shadowy figure, she bolted out the door with nothing but her phone, her wallet, and the trembling sense that she had just escaped something far worse than she could imagine. Sitting in the safety of an all-night diner, Amber wrapped her hands around a mug of lukewarm coffee. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the apartment. She scrolled through her phone, frantically searching for information about Shadowview Apartments. The articles she'd read before didn't seem to touch on the specific nightmare she was living. Then, deep in a Reddit thread about urban legends, she found a comment that made her blood run cold. "Room 213 isn't like the others. If you're there, leave. It won't let you go easily, though." Room 213, her apartment. Amber's breath caught. She hesitated before replying to the anonymous commenter. "What do you mean? What happened in 213? The response was almost immediate. "It's not what happened. It's who stayed. She's still there, and she doesn't like company." Amber dropped her phone, the clatter drawing a few curious glances from other late-night patrons. The next morning, she returned to the apartment, the rising sun giving her the courage she lacked at night. The hallway leading to her door felt unnervingly quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Amber paused outside the door, gripping her keys tightly. As she stepped inside, the atmosphere was different. The air was thick, charged, like the calm before a storm. Her eyes were immediately drawn to the wall in her bedroom. The message from last night was gone. No dark letters, no evidence that anything had been there at all. "Am I losing my mind?" she muttered. She decided to confront her roommate, or whatever was inhabiting the other room. Amber knocked on the door, her fist trembling. "Listen," she said firmly. "I don't know what's going on here, but I deserve some answers. Who are you? Why are you doing this?" No response. "I'm not going anywhere until you talk to me," she shouted. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then the door creaked open just a fraction. Amber took a step back as the oppressive cold from inside the room seeped into the hallway. A voice, barely above a whisper, floated out. "You should have left when you had the chance." Amber pushed the door open, stepping inside. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tightly over the windows. The air smelled of mildew and something metallic, like rusted iron. The figure stood in the corner, shrouded in shadow. "Who are you?" Amber asked, her voice breaking. The figure tilted its head, the movement unnatural and jerky. "I'm what's left," it said. "What stayed behind when the rest of me was taken." Amber's heart raced as the figure stepped closer, the shadows peeling away to reveal a woman, or what had once been a woman. Her skin was pallid, her eyes sunken and rimmed with dark hollows. Her lips were cracked and colorless, but when she spoke, her voice was full of venom. "You shouldn't be here," the woman hissed. "This place doesn't belong to you." Amber backed toward the door, but the woman's figure blurred, reappearing in front of her in an instant. "You wanted answers?" the woman sneered. "Fine, I'll show you what you're dealing with." Before Amber could react, The woman reached out, her cold hand brushing against Amber's forehead. Suddenly, Amber was no longer in the apartment. She was standing in a dimly lit room, her surroundings unfamiliar yet suffocatingly oppressive. The walls were lined with pictures of smiling people, their faces frozen in time. A man's voice echoed from somewhere in the distance. "This apartment is perfect for you," he said, "but you must follow the rules." Amber turned to see a younger version of the pale woman standing beside the landlord, Mrs. Klein. Her smile was polite but strained. "What rules?" the younger woman asked. Mrs. Klein's smile widened. "No visitors. No leaving the apartment after dark. And under no circumstances should you enter the other room." Amber watched as the younger woman nodded, oblivious to the weight of those words. The vision shifted, and Amber was back in the apartment. The younger woman was standing in front of the forbidden room, curiosity etched on her face. As she reached for the doorknob, Amber wanted to scream, to warn her to stop, but it was too late. The door swung open, and darkness poured out, engulfing the woman. Her screams echoed through Amber's mind as the vision dissolved. Amber was back in her own body, gasping for air. The pale woman stood before her, her expression unreadable. "I broke the rules," the woman said quietly, "and now I'm trapped here. Forever." Amber's voice trembled as she asked, "Why me? Why now?" The woman's eyes glinted with something almost like pity. "Because this place is hungry, and it won't stop until it gets what it wants." Amber stood frozen in place, the growl reverberating through the apartment like a warning bell. Her grip tightened on the phone, the ominous text message glowing on the screen. The pale woman before her, her undead roommate, watched her with hollow eyes, her expression a mixture of urgency and regret. "Run," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "Run while you still can." Amber turned toward the door, but the shadows around the room began to shift and stretch, like living entities with a will of their own. They crept toward her, blocking her escape route. "What does it want?" Amber shouted, panic lacing her voice. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back into the shadows, her translucent figure dissolving into the darkness. Amber's mind raced as she searched for a way out. The oppressive atmosphere of the apartment was growing heavier, pressing down on her chest like an unseen weight. She clutched her phone, instinctively dialing the first person she could think of. Zoe, her best friend. Zoe picked up after a few rings, her voice groggy. "Amber? It's like 6 in the morning. What's going on?" "Zoe," Amber whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Something's wrong with my apartment. I need help." There was a pause on the other end. "What are you talking about? Are you okay?" "No," Amber said, her voice breaking. "There's someone here, or something. I don't even know anymore. Please just come over. I need to get out of here." Zoe hesitated but finally relented. Okay, I'm on my way. Just hang tight." As Amber ended the call, the growling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. But the shadows remained, swirling and pulsating as if alive. The wait for Zoe felt like an eternity. Amber paced the living room, every creak of the floorboards making her jump. She kept her eyes on the door, praying it would open and Zoe would appear. When the knock finally came, Amber nearly screamed in relief. She ran to the door and flung it open. "Zoe? Thank God." Her words died in her throat. It wasn't Zoe. Standing in the hallway was an older man, his face pale and weathered, his eyes sunken and distant. He wore a janitor's uniform, a name tag pinned to his chest that read Henry. "You're in trouble," Henry said, his voice low and gravelly. Amber blinked, confused. "Who are you?" Henry ignored the question, stepping closer. This apartment, it's cursed. Always has been. You shouldn't have moved in here. Amber stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. What do you mean, cursed? What's happening to me? Henry glanced over his shoulder, as if checking to make sure they were alone. This place feeds on people. It traps them, wears them down, and takes what it wants. Why didn't anyone warn me? Amber demanded, anger and fear bubbling to the surface. Henry shrugged. People don't believe in curses until it's too late. But if you want to survive, you need to listen to me. Amber nodded, desperation outweighing skepticism. What do I do? Henry's eyes darkened. You need to sever its hold on you. That means finding whatever's anchoring it to this place and destroying it. Before Amber could ask more questions, the hallway lights flickered. Henry's face twisted in fear. It knows I'm here, he muttered. I can't stay long. He reached into his pocket and handed Amber a small, worn journal. Everything you need to know is in here, but be careful. The more you fight it, the harder it fights back. With that, Henry turned and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Amber clutching the journal. Amber closed the door, her hands shaking as she opened the journal. The pages were filled with cryptic notes, sketches, and warnings. One entry caught her eye. Room 213 is the heart. It's where she died. The object binds her to this place. Destroy it and you might be free. Amber's stomach churned. She thought about the pale woman, the shadowy figure she'd come to know as her roommate. Was she the one who died here? The journal didn't say what the object was, but Amber had a sinking feeling it was somewhere in the forbidden room. Zoe arrived soon after, her expression a mix of concern and confusion. Amber, what the hell is going on? You sounded terrified on the phone. Amber pulled Zoe inside, locking the door behind her. I know this sounds insane, but my apartment is haunted, or cursed, or something. I don't even know how to explain it. Zoe raised an eyebrow. Haunted? Seriously? I'm not joking, Zoe. Amber snapped. There's something here, and it's not gonna stop until it gets what it wants. Zoe hesitated but eventually nodded. Okay, what do we do? Amber held up the journal. We need to find an object that's anchoring it to this place. If we destroy it, we might be able to break the curse. Zoe looked skeptical but followed Amber as she led the way to the forbidden room. The door creaked open, revealing the dark, icy space beyond. Amber and Zoe stepped inside, the air so cold it made their breath visible. The room was empty, save for a single, dusty trunk in the corner. Amber's heart pounded as she approached it, the journal's warnings echoing in her mind. She knelt down and opened the trunk. Inside was an assortment of old belongings. A locket, a diary, and a photograph of a young woman who looked eerily familiar. Amber picked up the photograph, her hands trembling. It's her, she whispered. The woman from the shadows. Before she could say more, the door slammed shut behind them. The shadows in the room came alive, swirling and closing in. The oppressive darkness pressed in on Amber and Zoe, its weight palpable. Amber's fingers tightened around the photograph, its edges still warm from the mysterious burning. Zoe clutched her arm, her breathing sharp and uneven. Amber, what's happening? Zoe whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know, Amber replied, her voice barely audible. She strained to see through the darkness, but it was absolute, as though light itself had been swallowed whole. The voice returned, echoing in the void. You should have stayed away. Now you've awakened me. Amber felt a chill run down her spine. Who are you? She demanded, her voice wavering but firm. There was no response, only the sound of something dragging across the floor. A slow, deliberate scrape that made Amber's blood run cold. Suddenly, the darkness shifted. A faint, ghostly glow began to emanate from the photograph in Amber's hand. The young woman in the picture moved, her expression changing from serene to sorrowful. Her lips parted as if she were speaking, but no sound emerged. Zoe recoiled. "Amber, the photo. It's moving." Amber stared, transfixed. The woman's eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, a surge of emotions flooded Amber's mind. Fear, grief, anger, and an overwhelming sense of despair. Then, the woman's voice broke through the silence, soft yet piercing. "Help me." The glow intensified, and the shadows recoiled, shrinking back as though repelled by the light. The oppressive atmosphere lifted just enough for Amber to catch her breath. Zoe pulled her toward the door. "We need to get out of here. Now." Amber hesitated, clutching the photograph. "Wait, she's trying to tell us something. Are you serious?" Zoe exclaimed, panic evident in her voice. "This place is a death trap." Before Amber could respond, the shadows surged forward again, more aggressive this time. They lashed out, cold tendrils wrapping around Amber's arms and legs, pulling her toward the center of the room. Zoe screamed and grabbed her friend, struggling to pull her back. "Amber, hold on." Just as it seemed the shadows would consume her, the photograph flared with blinding light, forcing the darkness to retreat once more. Amber collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The glow from the photograph dimmed, but the woman's voice lingered in the air. "Find the locket. It holds the key." Amber looked toward the open trunk. Among the scattered items lay the small, tarnished locket she'd seen earlier. She scrambled to grab it, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. The moment she touched it, a wave of energy surged through the room. The shadows froze, quivering as though in fear. Amber opened the locket with trembling hands. Inside was a tiny, faded portrait of the same woman from the photograph and a lock of hair, brittle with age. Beneath it was a small engraving, "To Eleanor with love. May we never part." "Eleanor," Amber whispered. "That must be her name." Zoe, still shaken, glanced at the locket. "Great, now we know her name. Can we please leave before something else tries to kill us?" Amber ignored her, piecing together the fragments of the mystery. The journal said she died here. What if this locket is what's anchoring her spirit to the apartment? Zoe frowned. "So what do we do? Burn it? Bury it? Call a priest?" Before Amber could answer, the air grew heavy again. The shadows began to swirl, forming a humanoid shape in the corner of the room. The figure stepped forward, its presence radiating malice. It wasn't Eleanor. It was something else entirely, something darker. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its voice was a guttural snarl. "You cannot save her," it growled. "She belongs to me." Amber stood her ground, clutching the locket tightly. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "I am the one who feeds on this place. Her suffering is my sustenance. And now yours will be too." Zoe grabbed Amber's arm. "Amber, we need to go. Now." But Amber didn't move. She stared at the locket, a plan forming in her mind. If this is what's keeping Eleanor here, maybe it's also what's keeping it here. Amber turned to Zoe. "We need to destroy the locket." Zoe's eyes widened. "Are you insane? What if that makes things worse?" "We don't have a choice," Amber said. "If we don't do something, it'll kill us." The shadowy figure began to advance, its form shifting and twisting as it approached. Amber's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. She held the locket over the photograph, the faint glow still emanating from it. "Eleanor," she whispered, "if you can hear me, I'm trying to help you. Tell me what to do." The woman's voice returned, faint but clear. "Burn it. Free me." Amber turned to Zoe. "We need fire. Do you have a lighter?" Zoe hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, cheap lighter. "I can't believe we're doing this," she muttered. Amber placed the locket on the floor and flicked the lighter. The tiny flame danced in her trembling hand. The shadowy figure roared, its voice filled with rage. "You dare defy me?" Amber ignored it, lowering the flame to the locket. The moment the fire touched the metal, the room erupted in chaos. The shadows screamed, writhing and thrashing as if in pain. The locket glowed white-hot, the engraving burning away. Amber and Zoe shielded their eyes as the light intensified, filling the room with a searing brilliance. When the light faded, the shadows were gone. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. Amber looked around, her heart still racing. "Is it over?" Zoe shook her head, her eyes scanning the room. "I don't know, but I think we should get out of here before it comes back." Amber picked up the now-charred locket. It was still warm, but its glow had faded. She slipped it into her pocket, a sense of unease lingering in her chest. As they left the apartment, Amber couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Amber couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor's smile. It wasn't one of gratitude or peace. It was something far more unsettling. A smile that lingered in her mind like a bad dream, growing darker the more she thought about it. Zoe had insisted on going back to her dorm, unable to handle the lingering tension. Amber didn't blame her. Yet, despite everything that had happened, Amber felt a pull, an unexplainable connection to Eleanor. Back at the apartment, Amber sat at her small kitchen table, the charred locket in front of her. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. "Why do I feel like this isn't over?" she murmured to herself. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Zoe. "Zoe, you're not still there, are you? Seriously, Amber, just leave." Amber stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to leave, but something told her she couldn't. "Not yet. Amber, I need answers. I'll be careful. Don't worry." Zoe's reply was immediate. "Zoe, famous last words." Amber sighed and set her phone down. She opened the journal again, flipping through its brittle pages. Most of the entries were mundane, descriptions of daily life, Eleanor's excitement about moving in, mentions of friends and work. But then the tone changed. The neat handwriting became shaky, desperate. Eleanor wrote about strange noises in the night, objects moving on their own, and a growing sense of being watched. One entry caught Amber's attention. October 23rd. "It's not just the apartment. It's him. He's always watching. I thought I could escape, but he followed me here. He feeds on fear, on pain. And now he wants me to join him." Amber shivered. Him. She remembered the shadowy figure that had tried to drag her into the darkness. Another entry followed. "If anyone finds this, please don't let him take you. Burn the locket. Destroy it. And whatever you do, don't trust the whispers." Amber's breath caught in her throat. The locket was supposed to free Eleanor, but instead, it had only made things worse. The lights flickered, and the room grew colder. Amber's eyes darted to the shadows in the corners of the room, which seemed to shift and writhe. She grabbed the locket and shoved it into her pocket. "If burning you didn't work, what will?" A faint knock echoed from the front door. Amber froze. It wasn't a normal knock. It was slow, deliberate, almost rhythmic. She approached the door cautiously, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" No answer. Amber's hand trembled as she gripped the doorknob. Against her better judgment, she opened the door. The hallway was empty. She stepped out, her bare feet brushing against the cold wooden floor. The corridor stretched out before her, bathed in dim, flickering light. Then she saw it. At the far end of the hall, a figure stood motionless, shrouded in shadow. It was taller than any person she'd ever seen, its outline unnaturally sharp. "Amber." The voice was a whisper, yet it felt as though it had been spoken directly into her ear. Amber staggered back, her breathing rapid. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice echoing down the hall. The figure didn't move, but the whisper came again. "Find the mirror." Amber blinked. "What mirror?" But the figure was gone, leaving only the suffocating silence. She backed into her apartment, slamming the door shut. Her mind raced. The journal hadn't mentioned a mirror. What did it mean? She grabbed her phone, intending to call Zoe, but the screen flickered and went black. "No," she muttered, shaking it, but it was dead. Then she heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from the bedroom. Amber grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, her hands trembling as she turned it on. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the path to her room. The scraping grew louder as she approached. "Please just be a rat," she whispered, though she knew better. She pushed the door open and scanned the room. First, everything seemed normal. Then her flashlight landed on the mirror above the dresser. It wasn't her reflection staring back. The glass rippled like water, and a face emerged. A twisted, distorted version of Eleanor's. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "Amber," the reflection hissed. Amber stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. What do you want from me?" The reflection leaned closer, pressing its hands against the inside of the glass as though trying to break through. "He lied," it whispered. "He always lies." Amber's mind raced. Who lied?" The reflection didn't answer. Instead, the glass began to crack, spiderwebbing outward. Amber turned to run, but the bedroom door slammed shut on its own. The cracks in the mirror deepened, and with a deafening shatter, it exploded. Amber shielded her face as shards of glass flew past her. When she opened her eyes, the room was empty. The mirror was gone, replaced by a gaping void in the wall. A cold wind seeped through the opening, carrying faint whispers. "Come?" Amber shook her head. "No, I'm done playing your games." But the pull was stronger now, almost irresistible. She approached the void cautiously, the flashlight trembling in her hand. Peering into the darkness, she saw a narrow staircase spiraling downward. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Amber, find the truth." Her legs moved on their own, carrying her toward the staircase. She hesitated at the edge, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But she couldn't. She had to know. With a deep breath, she stepped into the darkness. Amber's steps faltered as she descended the narrow spiral staircase, her flashlight flickering erratically. The air grew thicker, colder, and carried a metallic tang that made her stomach churn. The whispers, once faint and distant, had now morphed into agonized wails, echoing from the shadows below. "What is this place?" Amber muttered, her voice trembling. The stairs seemed endless, winding deeper into the darkness. With every step, she felt the oppressive weight of something watching her, something waiting. Finally, Amber reached the bottom. The staircase opened into a cavernous chamber, dimly illuminated by an otherworldly glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The floor was uneven, scattered with strange, jagged symbols carved into the stone. At the center of the room stood an ornate mirror, larger and more elaborate than the one in her apartment. Its frame was made of twisted metal, pulsating faintly as though alive. The glass shimmered, reflecting not the chamber, but an endless void. And then she saw them, two glowing red eyes, piercing through the darkness of the mirror. Amber, the voice rumbled, deep and resonant, sending shivers down her spine. "Who are you?" she demanded, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The eyes narrowed, and the voice chuckled, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the chamber. "You already know. You felt my presence since the moment you stepped into that apartment." Amber's heart raced. "Eleanor, was she trapped by you?" The creature laughed again. "Eleanor was foolish, but she served her purpose. As will you." Amber stepped back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "I'm not afraid of you," the voice hissed, a sound like steam escaping under pressure. "Fear is irrelevant. You're here because you seek answers, but answers come with a price." The mirror's surface rippled, and a figure began to take shape. Eleanor. But this wasn't the Eleanor Amber had seen before. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her movements jerky, as though controlled by invisible strings. "Amber, please," Eleanor whispered. "You have to leave. He's using you." Amber's grip tightened on the flashlight. "Eleanor? What's going on? How do I stop this?" Eleanor's gaze darted to the symbols on the floor. "The carvings, they're part of the binding. Destroy them, and you can weaken him," the voice roared, shaking the chamber. "Silence!" Eleanor flinched, her form flickering like a bad signal. "Amber, hurry!" Amber dropped to her knees, running her fingers over the carvings. They were deep and intricate, but she didn't have time to analyze them. Using the edge of the flashlight, she began scratching at the symbols. As she worked, the air grew heavier, and the room seemed to close in around her. Shadows crawled along the walls, twisting and writhing like living creatures. The creature in the mirror snarled, its red eyes burning brighter. "You think you can defy me?" it growled. Amber ignored it, focusing on the symbols. Her hands ached, but she didn't stop. Suddenly, the chamber was filled with a deafening roar. The carvings began to glow, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. "Amber, keep going," Eleanor urged, her voice growing faint. One by one, the symbols faded as Amber scratched them out. The mirror's glow dimmed, and the creature's form began to waver. But then, the shadows surged forward, coalescing into a towering figure. It had no discernible features, just a mass of darkness with those blazing red eyes. The creature lunged at Amber, its movements fluid and unnatural. She rolled out of the way just in time, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. "Eleanor, what now?" she shouted. Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "The locket. Use it." Amber's hand shot to her pocket, pulling out the charred locket. It felt warm, almost burning, as if reacting to the energy in the room. She held it up, and the creature recoiled, letting out an ear-splitting screech. "You dare use her relic against me?" it roared, its voice a mix of anger and pain. Amber didn't hesitate. She hurled the locket toward the mirror. It struck the glass with a blinding flash of light, and the entire chamber shook violently. The mirror began to crack, shards falling away to reveal the void behind it. The creature writhed, its form flickering as though it was being pulled into the darkness. Amber shielded her eyes from the intense light, her ears ringing from the creature's screams. Eleanor's voice cut through the chaos. "Amber, this is your chance. Seal it." "How?" Amber shouted. "The symbols. Draw the final one." Amber's mind raced. She didn't know what the final symbol was, but her instincts guided her. Grabbing a piece of shattered glass, she etched a new mark into the floor. A symbol that felt right, though she didn't know why. The chamber fell silent. The mirror shattered completely, and the creature let out one final, anguished roar before being sucked into the void. Amber collapsed, her body trembling from exhaustion. The glow in the room faded, leaving her in complete darkness. "Eleanor," she called out weakly. There was no response. Amber felt her way back to the staircase, her legs heavy with every step. As she climbed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. When she finally emerged back into her apartment, the air felt lighter, almost normal. But the mirror on the dresser was gone, replaced by an empty frame. Amber sank onto the couch, her mind racing. Was it over? Her phone buzzed. She grabbed it eagerly, hoping it was Zoe. But the message wasn't from Zoe. "Unknown, you can't escape me." Amber's breathing quickened as she stared at her phone. The message, "You can't escape me," was like a blade to her resolve. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed alive, shifting and pulsing in rhythm with her rapid heartbeat. She scrambled off the couch, gripping her phone tightly. "No, this isn't happening," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. But the air grew colder, the silence in the room heavier, as though something unseen was drawing closer. Amber's instincts screamed at her to run. But run where? The apartment building itself was a labyrinth of secrets, and there was no guarantee that leaving would free her from this torment. Instead, she grabbed her laptop, desperate to find answers. She typed frantically, breaking a curse on an apartment, undead roommate, mirror entities. The results were vague superstitions, urban legends, forums filled with half-believed ghost stories. One thread caught her attention. Binding rituals gone wrong. Amber clicked, her eyes scanning the page. The post detailed how entities trapped in mirrors could escape if the binding symbols were disrupted improperly. The final symbol, "Did I mess it up?" Her stomach twisted. She remembered the rush of drawing the last mark, the desperate instinct that had guided her hand. What if she'd made it worse? The floor creaked behind her. Amber froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Amber," a voice whispered, low and raspy, sending a chill down her spine. Slowly, she turned. The corner where the shadows had writhed was now occupied. A figure stood there, tall and lean, with its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its eyes glowed faintly, a dull red that burned with silent menace. Amber bolted from her chair, backing away until her legs hit the coffee table. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The figure didn't move. It merely stared, its presence suffocating. Amber's phone buzzed again. She tore her eyes away from the figure just long enough to glance at the screen. "Unknown, you let it in. Now it's free. Who are you?" Amber yelled at the phone, her frustration boiling over. The figure took a step closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Amber grabbed the first object within reach, a decorative vase, and hurled it at the figure. It shattered on impact, but the entity didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned closer, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. "You can't fight me," it whispered, its voice like gravel. "You belong to me now." Amber bolted for the door. She yanked it open and fled into the hallway, not daring to look back. Her bare feet slapped against the cold tiles as she raced toward Zoe's apartment. She pounded on the door. "Zoe, open up." After a few agonizing moments, the door creaked open. Zoe's wide eyes met Amber's panicked gaze. "Amber? What's wrong?" "There's something," Amber began, but her words caught in her throat as she glanced over Zoe's shoulder. The interior of Zoe's apartment was dark, save for the faint glow of a television. But on the wall, a shadow moved unnaturally, its form twisting and expanding. "It's here," Amber whispered, stepping back. Zoe turned to look, her expression shifting from confusion to terror. "What the hell is that?" The shadow detached from the wall, forming into a humanoid shape. It moved toward them with unsettling fluidity. "Run!" Amber grabbed Zoe's arm and pulled her into the hallway. They sprinted down the corridor, the shadow following silently, its presence oppressive and unrelenting. "Where are we going?" Zoe gasped, her voice tinged with panic. "The basement," Amber said. "There's something down there. It's connected to all of this." "The basement? Are you insane?" Zoe pulled her arm free, stopping abruptly. "We need to call the police or something." Amber shook her head. "You don't understand. This isn't something the police can handle. I've seen what's down there. It's the only way." Zoe hesitated, glancing back at the encroaching shadow. "Fine. Lead the way." They descended the spiral staircase, Amber's flashlight flickering in the suffocating darkness. The air grew colder, and the whispers from before returned, louder and more insistent. Zoe clung to Amber's arm. "What is this place?" "It's where it all started," Amber said, her voice barely audible. "There's a mirror down here, a portal or something. I tried to destroy it, but I think I made it worse." The chamber was just as Amber had left it, the mirror's shattered frame still lying in pieces on the floor. But the void within the mirror was still there, swirling like liquid shadow. The whispers grew louder as they stepped closer. "Okay, now what?" Zoe asked, her voice shaky. Amber scanned the room, her mind racing. "We need to seal it. Permanently." "How do we do that?" Amber hesitated. "I don't know, but there has to be a way." The shadow entered the chamber, its form twisting and expanding. It moved toward the mirror, as though drawn to its energy. Amber felt a sudden surge of determination. She grabbed a shard of the mirror's frame and began etching new symbols into the floor. "What are you doing?" Zoe demanded. "Trust me," Amber said. "I've seen this before. The symbols keep it contained." The shadow recoiled as the symbols began to glow faintly. But then, the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The void in the mirror swirled violently, and the ground beneath them trembled. "It's not working," Zoe shouted. Amber gritted her teeth, her hands shaking as she continued etching. "Just hold on." The shadow lunged toward them, its form breaking apart and reforming with terrifying speed. Amber grabbed the locket from her pocket and held it up. The shadow hissed, retreating slightly. "It's afraid of this," Amber realized. "The locket. It's the key." Amber placed the locket in the center of the symbols, and the room exploded with light. The shadow screamed, its form dissolving into the air. The void in the mirror began to shrink, its edges folding inward until it disappeared entirely. Silence fell over the chamber. "Is it over?" Zoe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amber nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. As they climbed back up to the apartment, Amber couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The locket felt heavier in her pocket, as though it still carried a piece of the darkness with it.